This episode of Serverless Chats is sponsored by Epsagon. This week, I'm chatting with Eric Johnson and Alan Tan about HTTP APIs for API Gateway. This is Serverless Chats, episode number 40. Hi everyone, I'm Jeremy Daly and you're listening to Serverless Chats. This week I'm chatting with Eric Johnson and Alan Tan. Hi Eric and Alan, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Hey Jeremy, thanks for having us.
So Eric, let's start with you. So you are a senior developer advocate for serverless at AWS. So why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about your background and what it is you do at AWS?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is I've been a developer since 1995. Yes, that's right. I am an old guy. Yeah. I've been doing serverless since serverless came out. The day they announced serverless, I looked at it and said, wow, why would you do anything different? I've been following that trail for a long time. I now work for AWS. I've been there for almost 2 years. I am a senior developer advocate for serverless at AWS. I love all things automated, all things serverless, and so I'm having a great time. And as far as our role, what we do is we're kind of a two-way conversation with developers and users of serverless. We like to teach on how to use serverless and get the message out on the best way to use serverless, how to make it useful for all workloads. But we also listen. We try to bring back what the developers are saying to the product team, to someone like an Alan Tan, so they know, hey, here's what people are saying, here's what they're wanting, here are the paper cuts, here's what they're loving, that kind of thing. So I love my role and appreciate you having me here today.
Awesome. All right, so Alan, you are a senior product manager. So why don't you tell the listeners about your background and then what you do as a senior product manager?
Yeah, so I started in computer science, right? I was a developer just like Eric for a long time, and then I went into product management, building products for big data analytics, data analysis, and most recently, I've been doing this for 2 years now on the API Gateway team, product manager for API Gateway. So what I do is I'm a senior product manager, so I talk to customers directly. I talk to people like Eric. I talk to people like Jeremy, yourself as well, to get the feedback of what customers are really looking for, and then translating that back into the product. So our customers think we're building the right thing, and they really love coming back to us and using the same product over and over again.
Awesome. All right. Well, so you work on the API Gateway team, and just the other day, AWS released HTTP APIs, which is really, really cool. So can you explain to the listeners what that is?
Yeah, of course. So just to start with some context of where that came from. So when I talk to customers, they usually come back to us for improvements and feature requests, right? But there are a few things that are really core to products. So more generally, when people think about products and things they use, whether that's like an appliance, a car, a computer, right? There are certain things they look for, which is how can we get this thing faster? How can we get it cheaper and better, right? API Gateway is no exception to that. Our customers come back asking us the same things. So last year, we started looking into how we can continuously deliver on these improvements for them. The result was HTTP APIs. So it offers the core functionality of REST API at a 71% lower price. That's at $1 per million in IAD, right? $1 per million requests. Sub 10 millisecond latency overhead at the P99 level. That's a 60% improvement. And way easier to use features. So you can think of HTTP APIs as the next generation platform for API Gateways API types, a kind of V2.
Awesome. Now, Eric, you have done a ton of stuff with API Gateway, with the REST APIs. You had your Happy Little APIs show on Twitch, kind of getting into all the details. I know you love service integrations and all that kind of stuff that you've been working on.
Yes, sir.
But you're pretty excited about HTTP APIs as well.
I am. Yeah. For me as a developer, HTTP API brings a lot. I'm going to start with the better part. The cheaper, faster, those are great. And I love those. And those are huge to our clients. But as a developer, the better part for me is the UI, is the interface. There's been a lot of work done on how do I as a developer interact with API Gateway, and how do I develop against API Gateway? And so, I mean, it just starts with something like the UI. When you get a look at the UI, and if you've seen it, we did announce it last year at reInvent. So if you've gotten in, you've seen it. Hopefully, you've seen, wow, this is a lot simpler. And one of the examples that I'll use is cores. And if you've ever heard me talk about API Gateway, I like to have everybody raise their hands and say, who loves cores? And this is going to surprise you. Nobody raised their hand except for one person, and he's a liar. So,
That's
you know,
probably
that's
me. That's
it
probably me
probably
who
is. Yes.
raises it. No, I hate cores as well.
Nobody loves cores, and cores is not, not easy, but it is a necessary thing. And so what a lot of folks end up doing is they just put stars in their cores. Hey, let anybody get to it, let anything happen, let anything you do it, because configuring cores is too complex. Well, with HTTP API, we've taken that, we've simplified that. I say we, but really, Alan's team, has done a lot of great work on this, but I take credit for it when Alan's not around. So what we've done is we've made the cores integration a lot easier to set up. So you can add, here's the domains that should be allowed to get to it. Here's the methods, and it's all in a simple UI. We've also taken, and extended that where we're able to simplify the return come out of your Lambda, your backend, and we use heuristics, which is a big word that I've just learned recently. But we use some logic to fill in the cores data in return to the customer. So a lot of the heavy lifting of configuring cores and other items have been simplified. So as a developer, I love it. And that's just one example, though.
Yeah, and speaking of that sort of reducing that complexity, another thing that is now available, and I should have said HTTP, well, it is hard to say. It's also a great SEO keyword, by the way. I think that you're going to find a lot of people finding HTTP APIs. But it just actually went GA. So you're right. It was in preview for quite some time. But going back to this idea of sort of reducing complexity, one of the things that you have to do with API Gateway is add in authorizers and some of these other things. But now you have like JWT authorizers built right into the service.
Yeah, that's right. So going on the same vein of things that both you and Eric have been talking about reducing complexity, JWT authorizer is one of those things we've heard our customers ask us a lot about from our REST API product. So how customers used to do it in our REST API product is that they would use a lambda authorizer, and they would just write custom code just to do OIDC auth or OAuth 2, and every customer has to do this. So what we've done with HTTP API's JWT authorizer is to build all this as a native feature inside the product. So customers don't have to write code. It's basically codeless. You just configure where your token is being issued from, what audience and what scopes will be part of it, and we will handle all of that for you.
Yeah, and one of the cool things that I've been seeing a lot of articles written about is this, is using something like Cognito, obviously, as a way to do it, but also being able to use Auth0. I saw somebody write an article about using Google Firestore, I think, in order to use the authorizer. Anything that can process those JWT tokens, you can plug that in natively into HTTP APIs.
Yeah, that's right. So we support the token regardless of where it's being issued from, ping, Okta, Cognito, right? So it's really being able for the customer to be able to bring any token they have and being able to use that with API Gateway.
Awesome. All right. So one of the things that I found was sort of experimenting with the new HTTP APIs, which is really hard to say, by the way, but it's hard to say it fast anyways, HTTP APIs. Maybe we just shorten it. But one of the things that I found is obviously the feature set isn't quite, you can't do everything in HTTP APIs that you can do in API Gateway. So this is obviously something where you said you've gone back and you've written this thing. I mean, is that something that we should be looking for in the future, is to be able to do more things with the service?
Yeah, with the HTTP API, we are looking to have feature parity with API or the REST API. Now, is that there right now? No, not yet, but it is. It's top priority. We're looking. We know that as we people ask us, which should I use? And I think we'll get into this a little later, but which should I use? My rule of thumb is generally start with HTTP API. If it doesn't have the service or the feature that you need, then go to API Gateway REST API. However, keep checking because we are looking to do feature parity to continue to build out the features that are in REST API to build them into HTTPI or something like that. But again, at the better, cheaper, faster way of doing it.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I wonder, a little bit like because I get that, and that's awesome. I mean, the idea of being able to continue to add features. This is what's great about serverless, right? It's just things keep getting added, and you don't need to do anything, which is pretty great. But who is this? Who is this targeted for, right? Because I think you see with API Gateway, you have a lot of API management controls, right? So you have everything from quota management to key management and all these other things that are sort of built in there. It's sort of great if you want to, build an API that allows customers to have access to a certain amount of data or a certain quota every day. You can't do that with HTTP APIs yet, but so who is this really targeted for?
So HTTPIs is targeted for developers, right? We wanted to make it the easiest platform for developers to build APIs. And just to add a bit onto what Eric was saying earlier, because we built HTTP APIs from scratch, right? We are able to start from a clean slate. So a lot of these new features we're going to be adding as part of feature parity. We're actually going back and looking at them and seeing how we can make those a lot easier to use. So it's really targeted for developers that are trying to build APIs. And Jeremy, you touched on API management as well. So this is also a set of capabilities that's available in REST API today. For going forward, another request we hear a lot from our customers is they're challenging us to look into the API management space and bring some innovation and disruption there. As you know, it's a very old space. A lot of our customers, especially when they're moving to AWS, are asking us to make this space easier. So this is a set of new capabilities we're looking into right now. Probably later this year, you'll see something.
Awesome. Yeah, because that's one of those things too where as a developer who mostly is building just APIs, right? I just want a synchronous invocation of a Lambda
Yeah.
function is essentially what I want. Adding on the cores and having to put extra stuff in the cloud formation and set up those response templates is such a pain. And then you've got all that extra overhead of things that you just don't need. So I really, really love how this is super slimmed down. And once you get a couple more of those core features in, I think that's going to be pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting as we talk to developers and how many are saying, look, we just want to we need to proxy a lambda, or we need to do this. Now, a lot of times, if you've seen anything I talk about, okay, but are you looking at the full feature set? Are you reinventing the wheel? But sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're just, look, we just need a simple authentication and a proxy or an API in front of a lambda or in front of a service, and that's HTTP API at the moment. I mean, it's a great way to just do that very quickly, and then as we start to, you're right, as we start to build out those features, then it's going to become for everybody.
Awesome. All right, so let's jump into some of the features that it has right now because I think that'd be useful to know what exactly we can do with it. So basic features, we have routes, right?
Yeah. With routes, yeah. So the way we've done, and we changed that a little bit. A route is just simply an HTTP API. It's simply a path and a method, right? So look, I'm going to hit the root, and it's going to be a get, a post, an any, or something like that. So routes are very simple. And then you can tie to that route. You can tie different integrations to different places going on. But yes, you have the basic concept of a route.
And what are the integrations that exist right now?
So currently we have Lambda, and I'm ticking them off on my fingers here. You can't see it, but we do have Lambda. We also have an HTTP proxy, so you confront another HTTP endpoint. And then we're adding private integrations, and I want to expand on that because I'm really excited about that. But those are the three integrations that we can do.
All right, so before we get into the integrations, because I know that's a whole that might take us an hour to get through.
Yeah.
We also have stages similar to API Gateway, right?
Right.
Yep.
All right, so you can still do your dev and your prod and things like that.
That's right. And we also added a new usability feature for stages, actually. We added the concept of auto deployment. So if as you change an API, your changes will automatically be deployed to the stage. This is also a big area of feedback we got from our customers where, as Eric was talking about earlier, right? Some of our customers are really just looking for a basic endpoint. They're just really looking for something to proxy traffic. And for them, having to learn more and more API gateway concepts might not be the most customer friendly, right? So we added auto deployment. So that's another concept you don't have to learn about until you really need it.
Yeah,
I can't tell you how many times I've been standing on stage demonstrating API gateway, did all the changes, and then spent 2 minutes going, "Why doesn't this work?"
because you
And
forgot to
what was
deploy.
I had exactly, and I have actually said to the audience, "Hey, if I start getting frustrated, this doesn't work. Somebody yell, deploy it." So
Yeah.
I'm really excited about the auto deploy. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, I think that it's subtle, but it is a really cool feature because if you think about your average developer who just again wants to put an HTTP endpoint in front of a Lambda function, for example, the problem is that again you're adding on all this complexity with API Gateway, and it's just another step that you have to go through. And so having that all kind of wrap into one, I think is pretty cool. Now, I personally don't like when every Lambda function has an HTTP gateway in front of it, similar to like maybe Google Cloud Functions or something like that, where those all have their own endpoint. But I do love this because it's a super simple way to kind of add that on top. So what about logging?
Yep, we
Yeah.
have access logging. Alan, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. We have access logging just like REST API. We actually added a new context variable to our access logs, which is integration error message. So you're able to see why your backend is not working. For example, if you're using it with Lambda, it'll tell you things like, hey, permissions weren't set up correctly. So you're able to easily debug using our access logs now as well.
Which
That's
again
super
is
helpful.
another huge
Yeah.
improvement, right? When you keep getting that internal server error coming back and you have no idea why, and then you realize, oh, wait a minute, my Lambda function processed correctly, but somehow my API gateway didn't respond correctly, or vice versa. So that's definitely a cool feature. All right, so let's get into private integrations because this is super cool stuff. So I don't know, Eric, you wanna start?
I do. I'm excited. Yeah. So private integrations. A lot of times, we get folks that are telling us, "Look, we've got, hey, and I know the three of us are serverless people, but apparently there are non-serverless architectures."
I don't believe it. I don't believe it.
I'm not, I don't either, but that's what they're telling me. So they said talk about it. No. So yeah. So when we're looking at API Gateway, we deal with VPCs, right? When you're dealing, especially with non-serverless architectures, you deal with VPCs, and that's a good thing. VPCs are a layer of security that, as in a past life as a solutions architect, we talk about security, and everything goes in a VPC. That's what we always hear. That's why sometimes with serverless, it kind of say, well, it doesn't have to be because it's already in a VPC, but that's another discussion. But so dealing with VPCs, when you're thinking about EC2s or you're thinking about container services like ECS or EKS, you need a way to be able to talk to basically front those with API Gateway. Now you can do it through some other ways like NLB or ALB, but you want to be able to take advantage of the API Gateway features that we've got, like the JWT or the throttling that we've added, different things like that. So we built private integrations, and I think we really did a great job on this, and Alan's team did an amazing job on this because it's not just NLB like REST does, which is is a great way. Look, we can point to an NLB and then we can get to stuff in a VPC, but we've also added the ability to use ALB. Which you can do path mapping. It's a level 4 versus a level 7. I don't know what that means, but there it is. No, it's on how the routing is done. I'll let Alan expand on that. But the other one that I'm really excited about is AWS Cloud Map. And if you're not familiar with Cloud Map, it gives you the ability to basically it's a service discovery product. So I can actually create a namespace that's going to maybe I'll just tie these are I can create a namespace on however I want it to be. I can say, look, I've got an application that does this. I'm going to create a namespace that matches that. In the namespace, I can make different services. So for instance, I may have like a tier 1 or tier 2 or my different tiers. However, I want to break my services apart. And then finally, in the name or in the service, I can register service instances. So let's take, for example, if I'm doing ECS. So I bring up a cluster, it's got 4 different machines in my cluster, right? So I can register those instances with Cloud Map. So API Gateway can use Cloud Map to get to those instances, to connect to the clusters. And so I've got a secure infrastructure. So I'm saying, look, API Gateway, for all intents and purposes, is in that VPC with those instances. I'm probably making Alan cringe right now because it's not actually in there, but we're using technology to connect those. So with security groups, when I'm locking down my security groups, I can say, hey, everything in this VPC security group, and that API gateway can be in there because of Cloud Map and because of the way it connects through. So, and Alan, feel free to correct any of that if you want, because you're obviously the big brain here, but I'm excited about the way we're doing the private integrations and the ability to build those. With Cloud Map, you can iterate fast, you can build them fast, you can change them out fast. It gives you serverless flexibility in non-serverless world.
That's right, Eric. I think you got it perfectly. I think it's totally fine what you said. No corrections needed.
Please do
Just
not
want
edit that out, Jeremy. That needs to stay in.
Okay, I just want to add on that while the cloud map capability is super cool, the ability to connect to a private ALB, actually that's one of our top feature requests we've heard from customers from our REST API product. So it's going to be super great for customers even if they continue using private ALBs.
So what exactly is the use case for that?
So a lot of our customers, when they're using ECS, because all the tutorials are focused around using ALBs, and ALBs generally itself is easier to use than NLBs because, like Eric said, it is a layer 7 product, so it has more features, more routing options. It's easier to set up. So a lot of ECS customers just have a stronger affinity to use private ALBs instead of NLBs.
Awesome. Hey everyone, I just wanted to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Epsagon. If you're running modern applications in the cloud like serverless and microservices, Epsagon can add distributed tracing and payload visibility to all of your workloads. It lets you discover, monitor, and alert on issues, plus you can search across every trace, payload, and log so that you can troubleshoot and solve the most complex issues in seconds, all through a single, easy-to-use web-based interface. It's also incredibly simple and fast to set up. There are no agents to install, no manual coding, no tagging, and no training required. It literally takes about 3 minutes to get this up and running. Then Epsagon will discover and instrument all of your application stacks with no coding changes. Now, I've known Nitzan, their CEO, and Ron, their CTO, for quite some time now, both of whom have actually been guests on this podcast, and they both bring an incredible amount of expertise to the observability space. The work that they and the team at Epsagon have done is amazing, and they've built a really, really solid product. So if you're looking for an observability tool that you can run on any of your production workloads, containers, Lambda, Kubernetes, Fargate, or even VMs, definitely check them out at epsagon.com. That's EPSAGON.com. All right, so what about migration? Okay, because now let's say I've got, I don't know, 200 API gateways or something like that I probably have configured for a number of customers and other people. How do I go from API gateway to HTTP APIs?
So to go from API gateways, REST APIs to HTTP APIs is actually pretty simple because they both support the Open API spec, right? You can go to REST API, export your API using Open API 3, and then import it using HTTP API, right? But as we mentioned earlier, or at least you alluded to, right, there are some features that are missing, right? So when you export from REST API and import to HTTP API, when you do that, if you look at the object that gets returned, we actually tell you exactly which features are missing. So you can actually use that as a sort of like an indicator for whether or not there are any updates you need to make, what you should be aware of, right? So you can take a look at the info object that's returned. Another thing we've done to help customers move from REST to HTTP is that we've made custom domains cross-compatible. So with one custom domain name, you can put a REST API based path mapping and an HTTP API based path mapping. So you can take a look at your current API. If it's REST API, right, bring it over to HTTP API, test that it works. And if it works, you can just swap the base path mapping under that custom domain. So your clients don't have to change any URLs. You don't have to update any URLs in your documentation or anything like that. Everything will just work.
Awesome. And I know that this is more about, specifically HTTP APIs, but I do want to touch on custom domains for a second because I really like this pattern. And maybe, Eric, you can talk about it a little bit more, but I find this ability to create new services. So, a microservice that's my billing service or my alerting service or whatever it is, create a separate, a separate group of functions and resources and things like that. Front that with an API gateway, and then use the custom domain mapping. So now that it's myapi.com/billing, myapi.com/alerting, or whatever that is. And that gives me a lot of control because now I can add endpoints, remove endpoints, add new services. I'm not worrying about, a single or a bunch of teams trying to publish to a single API gateway and map those all over the place. So that's a really, really cool feature. So Eric, I mean, this is just great because now I can say, look, maybe I have one service that needs a service integration, or it needs one of these features of API gateway REST APIs. But if my other 10 services just need simple, proxying, then I can use the HTTP APIs for that.
Yeah, no, I love it too. When you think about that, we get a lot of questions on how do I architect service architectures, or how should it look? Are all 300 lambdas in one application so they can be behind it? What we say no. We really encourage folks to find a logical breaking point for serverless applications, or applications in general. I mean, it really is not just a serverless thing. It's anything. And so being able to take and say, okay, I'm going to have, instead of one large application, I'm going to have 10 micro applications.
Mhm.
And each one of those are going to be microservice architectures, And so then I can put, one, base path mapping right in front of it. And then I can, just, route that around as I need, rather than having to, okay, I'm going to try to do some funky routing. I'm going to put an API gateway and then sub API gateways. And you can do that. You can certainly do that, especially if you're trying to maybe unify or consolidate your authentication. But base path mapping is a simple way to say you go there, you go there, you go there. You have a lot of control, and it's another thing. And I don't know if you want to touch on this now or later, but it's also really helpful when it comes to the strangler pattern.
I was just going to say,
okay.
I was just going to say that because I think it's a new way. It's a new way to think about the strangler pattern, right? I mean, obviously ALB was a great way to do it because you could route things right to your Lambda functions and start splitting off, like you said, that layer 7, start splitting them off at the path level, which is pretty cool stuff. But using an API gateway to do that, it was just expensive. There was a lot of overhead and things like that. But now with the HTTP proxying in HTTP APIs, which is pretty inexpensive, and the custom domain capabilities, now you've got some more options there.
You do. Going forward, HTTP API will be referred to as API unless otherwise designated. Does that help?
Is that the official AWS stance?
Nope, that's the Eric Johnson stance who can barely speak English as it is. So no, so yeah, and that's an interesting idea. If you're not familiar with the strangler pattern, just so the idea is, let's say I've got an old legacy application that's a bunch of different services all in one. I can actually put. So we'll talk about API gateway for a minute. I can put API gateway in front of it, and then as I start breaking out those little services, I could say, okay, now I'm going to reroute to serverless or some other type of architecture, which should be serverless, and I'm going to break those out until eventually I've strangled that application until it's gone, right? And so everything's broken out. But if you wanted to, you could say, I'm going to take my application and I'm going to, instead of breaking it into a single service, I'm going to break it down into maybe 10 micro applications. And I'm going to say to my teams, I'm going to take 10 teams, I'm going to say, build these 10 applications. And when you're ready, we'll just put a custom domain path in front of it, and we'll route to your API gateway. And it can be, a REST API if you need it. It can be a HTTP API if you need it. And I have the ability to send to either and change as needed. So yeah, it's kind of a level up of the strangler pattern.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so let's talk about sort of the practical use cases of this now. So if I'm a developer, and like you said, Eric, first thing you do is use HTTP APIs. That'll be your de facto standard unless you need something else. But what are some of the reasons why I would use API gateway REST APIs or maybe something like ALB over the new HTTP APIs?
So between REST and HTTP API, I think if you're, as Eric was saying earlier, if you're bringing in new traffic, you should take a look at HTTP API and see whether that's a good fit for you. Because, like I said, it is going to be the next generation platform for us to build our API improvements, right? If there are any feature gaps or feature parity type things, as I mentioned earlier, we're also going to bring those over time, right? So you shouldn't let any, feature gaps worry you about, whether or not we're going to support that in the future, right? We definitely are. But going to ALB and API Gateway now, while there's some overlapping features, they're really quite different. So I think really similar to earlier, the rule of thumb is just to pick whichever one meets your needs and where you think your needs are going to be in the future, right? So for example, API Gateway offers throttling, authorization, publishing APIs, monetizing APIs, serverless WebSockets, right? So you don't need to worry about these kinds of things in your backend code. So going back to the strangler pattern, for example, if you're using a Lambda function and if you're using your legacy on-prem backends, for example, and there's some authorization authentication you want to add for all these APIs, API Gateway is a really good place to put that because then you don't really need to worry about having, a authorization library in your Lambda code and an authorization library in your backend code and trying to keep that consistent over time. Because consistency is really hard, especially when you're talking about doing code manually, right?
Yeah.
So that's the kind of benefit that you get with API Gateway. You get a consistent layer where you can put some of these logic in. And also being serverless, if you're not serving any traffic, you're also not being charged.
Right.
So it's really good for highly variable workloads where you need to scale up and down, and you don't need to maintain a minimum footprint. ALB on the other hand works really well if you have already if you already have all that logic that's already handled, right? So you're already handling throttling, caching, authorization in your backend code, and you don't really care about having to maintain that over time. So it's really good if you already have those things. The pricing model works really great if you have a lot of small requests and you already serve like a very consistent level of traffic, because how ALB works is there is a base price for keeping the load balancer around.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really good if you already have a minimal footprint for your traffic.
I would add in also, and I completely agree with Alan, but a lot of times when we have the discussions and I'm in the field, it's the, I don't use any of the features on API Gateway. So, why do I need to use it? And that's
Mm-hmm.
fair. And if you really are not, okay, that's something to look at and maybe ALB works out. But what I encourage people is, you ask, okay, are you handling caching? And, yeah, we're writing to like an elastic cache from Lambda. I was like, okay, well, we can, I can help you not do that and just, offload it. I really encourage people to figure out what are they doing in the Lambdas or the backend integrations that can be rolled off into API Gateway.
Mm-hmm.
And because then you start, and I know people hear this a lot, but you start looking at the total cost. The TCO, the total cost of operating it, right? And you look at how much code are we writing to do stuff that's already available. I'm a big fan of less code. If I build an application, the most dangerous part of an application is my code. There's just no two ways about it. And so my encouragement is, if you don't have to code it and you have a service, and sometimes you look at that price factor, but you have to look at the price factor in light of how much developer time, how much operational time, how much management time is going into putting it into your code versus rolling it off. And especially with the drop in cost with the HTTP API, when you're paying at a third of the cost, and as we reach feature parity, I just think it's the way to go. Like I said, rule of thumb, that's the first place I go.
Well, yeah, no, I think I think you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, the biggest thing for me too is, why rebuild something if it already exists? And I mean, it has to exist in a way that works for you, right? And so obviously caching in API Gateway, in the REST API version, is very good for the right use case, right? You can't always cache everything,
Right.
but same thing with like request transformations. I mean, that's a really cool feature that I don't think a lot of people use, but you probably should if you want to limit. You can have the same Lambda function that responds to requests and actually spit them back in different ways using different endpoints, using request transformations and things like that. And then one thing too about authorizers. So custom authorizers, loved that feature when it came out, but now, with API Gateway. But honestly, if you think you can write a better standard than JWT or OAuth 2 or something like that. Good for you. I mean, go and give it a try. But honestly,
Good on you.
I think it's probably smarter when it comes to security to maybe use something that is is a pretty good standard. So yeah, I mean, and like you said, there are a couple of things like the usage plans, an API key management that you can't do in HTTP API right now. There's also no X-ray integration yet, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's also coming really very soon.
Awesome. All right. And then just some other things too. I have some notes here just because I like to be thorough. But things like client certs, WAF, and resource policies. So those aren't supported, right?
Yeah, those aren't supported right now, but it's part of the feature parity bucket of work. So that's a bucket of work we're going to be looking into bringing over and seeing how we can do those better.
Awesome. All right. So one more question about ALB though, and just in terms of the scale up, right? So if you need to scale very quickly, is it ALB? Is it HTTP APIs? Is it API gateway? What handles a fast scale up?
That would be API gateway. So API gateway for both REST and HTTP APIs, and even WebSocket actually, your account is actually provisioned for 10,000 RPS, and you can scale up from 0 to 10,000 as quickly as you want. And if you need even higher than 10,000, we can easily increase that for you. We've gone with customers significantly higher than that, like way higher for sporting events and big announcements type deals, right?
All right, yeah. So that scaling is pretty intense, and again, I always like to say, if you have to scale that much, then you've got some really good things going on, going on with your application. So that's good stuff. All right, so one of the other things that HTTP APIs doesn't do yet, and I don't want to harp on this fact because I know we've talked about feature parity, and I know the teams are working on it. And I think that the fact that it's built in a way that you started from scratch, right? Like it's sort of a new product altogether. And as you mentioned, it's going to give a ton of flexibility going forward. But with the existing service integrations in API Gateway, a very common pattern, and this is something, Eric, you talk about quite a bit, is this idea of taking data right from the request and putting it right into some service, whether that's SQS or it's Kinesis or it's DynamoDB, being able to handle those service integrations. And I think you call it storage first, which I think is really an interesting way to think about it. So I know that doesn't exist yet. I know it's going to come at some point, right? But let's talk about that pattern, because I think that's really interesting feature of using something like API Gateway or the REST APIs and eventually HTTP APIs that lets you take that request, forget about the Lambda function, just make sure you capture it, store that data, and then do something with it.
Yeah, no, and I do call it storage first, or sometimes I do a presentation called thinking asynchronously. But the idea, and let me go back to my earlier statement. The most dangerous part of an application that I'll ever build is my code, right? So when I build an application, I want to get that data stored first. That's the thing. And if it's in, I tend to go DynamoDB because that's what I like. That's what I use. But there's different purposes. I know, Jeremy, you and I have had this conversation before, and you're an SQS guy. So that's where you tend to go. So and we do this because we look at, okay, what's the pattern for you? I know for like the retry or the DLQ or different things like that. And for me, it's because I'm going to continually write back to Dynamo on the app I'm specifically thinking about it. But the idea is, if API Gateway can directly integrate with the storage, be it S3, be it DynamoDB, something like that, then I've stored the data and I don't have to go back to the customer if my logic fails, right? So in an application, I've stored the data. Let's say I'm using DynamoDB. I do a stream. It triggers a Lambda. I start processing that data. If somewhere in there something breaks, and again, it's going to be my code, but let's say something breaks, then I don't have to go back to the customer and say, hey, guess what? I blew it. Can you give me your data again? Can you resubmit that and continue to trust me, because I'm sure I won't lose it again. Instead, I've got that data stored and I can write in some retry or take advantage of the retry from an SQS or an SNS or something like that. And so I think it's a really cool pattern for building resilience into our application. Serverless comes with a lot of resilience anyway. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's how AWS has approached this on, look, as much as we'd like to say nothing nothing ever breaks. Let's write as if it does. Right. And so let's degrade gracefully. And I think this adds even another layer of that where I can degrade in my code and know, hey, I've still got the data. I can write some retry logic. I can use existing retry logic. I think it's a safer pattern. So, and it does require, the storage first is the pattern, I call it, but it requires thinking asynchronously. What can I do after I've responded to the client? And how do I work with them?
Absolutely. Awesome. So, Alan, what do you think about that?
I think it's super powerful, and we see a lot of our customers doing that actually, especially after Eric published his blog that talks about this thinking, right? And showing a fully functional demo about creating what was it, like a
The URL shortener.
URL shortener? Yeah, that's right.
Glad it impacted you a lot.
Yes.
I'm just kidding.
And as we look at HTTP APIs, we know actually setting up service integrations in REST API is actually kind of a pain, right? So in HTTP API, we're going to make it super simple, just as easy as it is to set up a Lambda integration today. So some background there. In REST API, if you set up a Lambda integration, super easy, paste in the ARN and you're done. If you try to set up anything else like DynamoDB SQS, there's a lot more setup steps, especially in writing a little transformation template. We're going to make all those super easy in HTTP API. So just as easy, if not easier than Lambda.
Oh, that's awesome. All right. Well, listen.
That excites me.
Yeah, no, the service integrations are not easy, which is why I typically use a plugin to help me do those because it's just a lot easier. But anyway, so listen, both of you, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this stuff. I mean, Alan, honestly, great work on HTTP APIs. I think this is going to be, like Eric said, this should probably be the first thing you look at once we get those service integrations in there, which are going to be easier. I love that idea, because that's the other thing is if learn from previous mistakes. Maybe they're not mistakes, but certainly make it less friction to get that stuff in there. So that's going to be absolutely awesome. And I look forward to maybe checking back in with you too and see when these new things come out. So if people do want to find out more about HTTP APIs, they can just go to the AWS site and click on API Gateway, and there's information there. And if they want to get in touch with you, Eric, how do they do that?
Best way is on Twitter. EDJ Geek is the best way to hit me. My DMs are open, and I'm always getting questions on that. So that's the best way to get me.
All right. And Alan, if people want to bug you with feature requests, how do they do that?
They can also reach me on Twitter, T_Alan. Eric's been bugging me a lot about getting a Twitter account, so I did that, right. And now people can reach out to me.
Awesome. And then you publish a lot on the Compute blog, right? The is it aws.amazon.com/blog/compute? There's 17,000 blog posts a day across all of AWS or something like that. So if you can,
all by me.
Anyways, all right. Well, listen, I will get all that stuff into the show notes. Thanks again for being here.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for having us.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you again.
And that's this week's Serverless Chat. I want to give a huge thank you to Eric Johnson and Alan Tan for being my guests this week, as well as to our sponsor, Epsagon. If you want to check out the show notes and a full transcript of this episode, you can find them at serverlesschats.com/40. For more Serverless Chats, be sure you subscribe and rate the show in iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or any of your favorite podcast apps. You can also connect with me on Twitter at Jeremy_Daily. And if you're interested in serverless and want to discover all the great new articles, use cases, and latest innovations from the serverless community, make sure you subscribe to the Off by None newsletter at offbynone.io. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to chatting with all of you again next week.